Good evening. Let's get started. Thank you very much for coming to this Dean Speaker Series. My name is Rich Lyons. I'm Dean here at Berkeley Haas. This is a terrific topic that we have here tonight, and a terrific panel, as you can see in front of you. We'll be discussing the topic of income inequality, and in a historical perspective, income inequality in the 21st century. We're fortunate tonight to have two leading thinkers, Emmanuel Saez from our Department of Economics here at UC Berkeley, who's done some absolutely foundational work in this area, and Professor Tyson, who thinks about these issues, writes about related issues, and of course has played such an important role in policymaking within the U.S. Before we get into the discussion, let me just say a few more words about the work that each of these two wonderful economists has done. I'll start with Laura Tyson. She is currently a professor here at the Haas School and director of our Institute for Business and Social Impact. She served as dean of London Business School from 2002 to 2006, and she was dean here of our own Berkeley Haas from 1998 to 2001. As most of you know, she served in the Clinton administration as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. That was 1993 to 1995. And also as director of the National Economic Council, 95 to 96. She's a member of the board of directors of Morgan Stanley, AT&T, CBRE Group Incorporated, and Silver Spring Networks, which is an economic advisory board, and also an economic advisory board member at the World Bank's IFC, the International Finance Corporation. Welcome to Laura, and we greatly appreciate your being here tonight, Laura. And our second panelist, as I mentioned, Emmanuel Saez, a professor here at our Department of Economics. He's also director of our Center for Equitable Growth here on the Berkeley campus. He received his PhD in economics from MIT in 1999. He was an assistant professor of economics post-MIT at Harvard University. That was 99 to 2002. He joined UC Berkeley's faculty in 2002. His main areas of research are centered around taxation and redistribution and inequality, both from a theoretical and also empirical perspective. He is currently the editor of the Journal of Public Economics and a co-director of the Public Policy Program at CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. He was awarded a remarkable distinction. He was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association. That's given every 2 years, I believe, for the economist who is under 40 that's done the most important work worldwide. It's an extraordinary honor. Thank you for being here as well, Emmanuel. So I'm the moderator here and timekeeper. We'll let each of them offer about 5 minutes of comments. I've got a few questions that I will ask them based in part on some of the things that they offer us, and then we'll turn it out to the group. So be thinking about what sorts of questions you would like answered. We've got the microphones. It's real important that we use the microphones in asking questions so that we can capture this content in the video and post it on our website. So the topic, as you know, is income inequality, thinking about inequality and wealth inequality in this 21st century. We've got some historical perspective on it. It is a topic that has received great attention in the academic world over the last year and a half, but it's been a topic in our social lives, our public lives, for all of us for years now. And we'll see a little bit about when the data started to bend and show very different patterns in the post-World War II era. That's some of the work that Emmanuel will bring, and then we'll get a chance to talk more about policy and implications and recommendations after that. So I'll turn it over to you, Emmanuel, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rich. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to show you a few of the salient facts we've gathered. So jointly with a number of colleagues, and first of them, Thomas Piketty, who's written this very famous book, Capital in the 21st Century, we've used tax statistics to construct long time series of income concentration in many countries in the world. So that's what we call the World Top Income Database. And so about almost 15 years ago, now I worked with Thomas Piketty at putting together figures for the United States that I want to show you tonight. So what this chart shows you is the share of total income going to the top 10% families in the United States from 1917 to 2012. And so what you can see is that this figure shows you a big U shape with high levels of income concentration. You know, the top 10% getting about 45% of total income before World War II, a significant drop during World War II, and then in the post-war decades, a much more equal society where the top 10% was getting, you know, in the low 30s, about a third of total income. And then, of course, the striking thing in that chart is the uptick that starts in the late 70s and is pretty steady, so that by 2012, the top 10% is getting, you know, 50% of total income, the highest it's ever been, at least over that period. The next thing I want to say is that this increase in income concentration is really a phenomenon that is very concentrated. That is, it really happens in the top 1%, because this chart splits, you know, the top 10% into three groups. In black, the top 1%, in blue, the next 4%, and in red, the next 5%. And you can see that really in the recent period, most of the increase really comes from the black line, that is the top 1%, whose share more than doubles, you know, from less than 10% to over 20%, with some gains in the next 4%, but small relative to what has happened in the top 1%. So now, another reason why we care about this is, you may ask, why do we care, you know, if the top 1% is doing so well? Well, we care because that phenomenon has been so extreme that really, when you are talking about overall economic growth versus growth for the bottom 99%, you get very different numbers. Another way of saying it is that the top 1% has really captured a very large fraction of economic growth. And so another historical chart, you know, that is striking to have in mind is this one that shows you economic growth over a century for the top 1% in black and the bottom 99% in white. You know, so both groups start at 100. You know, that's the basis in 1913. And then, of course, there is economic growth, so that today, you know, 1 century later, they are at 400. You know, incomes are 4 times per family, 4 times higher. You know, that's economic growth. What is striking, though, is that the pattern of growth is very different. That is, you have a period here, you know, from the New Deal, you know, the end of the Great Depression to the 70s, where growth is very strong for the bottom 99% and slow for the top 1%. And that's a time, you know, where the political and the policy environment in terms of financial regulation, very progressive taxation, is indeed unfavorable, you know, to the top incomes. And then when those policies are dismantled, you know, financial deregulation and the drop in tax progressivity, you see the reverse pattern happening. Namely, you know, the top 1% grows extremely fast and the bottom 99% grows slows down. You see it's a much flatter line. So those are really a striking fact. The last one I want to show you is some international evidence, because we've gathered evidence, you know, from many countries. So let me just show you the case of France. The top 1% income share, you know, you've seen it for the US in black, in France in red. So both countries, and actually that's true overwhelming, you know, pretty much all countries at very high levels of income concentration 1 century ago. In all countries, it pretty much came down. But in the recent period, you've seen a divergence across countries. That is, the US having a large increases in income concentration, France much more modest one. And that striking, you know, contrast shows you that globalization, technological progress is not going to be enough to explain everything. It's really how it interacts with each country's institutions and policy, and I hope we can discuss that. So let me stop here on the facts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emmanuel. Laura, thank you.
Well, I thought I might start by just framing a set of questions for all of us to think about, and that is Emmanuel and his colleagues have done the most brilliant work of putting together the case for the evidence of increasing income inequality and how that plays into increasing wealth inequality and all of the implications of that. I just want to frame the discussion by saying, so what? Why does it matter? Why should we care about income inequality? And there are several things that economists have proposed that, and there's research to support this. I will just start with the observation that Jason Friedman, in a recent Council of Economic Advisors address in the summer, noted that we've had average real income stagnation for the bottom 90% in the U.S. and in Europe for a considerable period of time, really going back to around the 1980 or so. Looking at the numbers a little differently, but you can see the stagnation of the broad middle as measured by the average family income of the bottom 90%. So it's not the top one, it's the bottom 90. That has a dampening effect on the ability of the population to consume, so consumption growth and income growth for the bottom 90%. And that, because consumption is such a major driver of economic growth, has implications for the growth rate. So when we think about inequality and growth, we need to think about the fact that inequality, which translates into stagnation of such a large percentage of the population, is going to set up a slower growth dynamic. And some of the studies, like the new studies by Robert Gordon, predicting slowing, even greater slowing of growth in the future, rest on this notion that the distribution of income will continue to be highly unequal, robbing the vast middle of the capability of driving rapid consumption growth and therefore rapid growth. Related to that, an argument that Bob Reich made, an argument that Rajamohan Rajan made, the current head of the Central Bank of India, is that when the middle class was hard-pressed in the U.S., so the expansion from 2001 to 2007 was the only post-war economic expansion in the United States, when the middle-income families saw no growth in their income, and there was a significant slide in income levels in the bottom 20-25%. How did they respond to that? They responded to that by reducing their savings rate, taking on debt, borrowing against the value of their houses. The financial market deregulation that Emmanuel talked about made that possible, to build up an unsustainable pile of debt to cause an explosion in housing prices, which was unwarranted and was not going to be sustainable. But you can see part of that as a consequence of a hard-pressed population to reduce their savings rate dramatically. We were down to zero savings rates, and take on debt as a way to maintain a hoped-for living standard while your income gains don't exist. So that's one whole set of macro reasons why we might care about income inequality. The second would be the vicious cycle of inequality in income leading to inequality in educational opportunity, leading to inequality in educational attainment levels. If you look at attainment levels of education by income group, what you see is large and growing differences in the attainment level. Now, if we believe we live in a world that we need higher levels of educational attainment and achievement to match with the demands of technology, we are robbing, by our income inequality, we are robbing educational opportunity, and therefore creating inequality in educational attainment levels, which generates further inequality in income. So it's a very vicious cycle, and related to that would also be inequality in educational opportunity, leading also to the Gatsby curve effect, which is essentially as income becomes more unequal and educational opportunities become more unequal, the possibility of social mobility declines. The evidence is that it's happening in the United States. So more unequal income, less equal education, more likely you are stuck in the same social or economic income level as your family. A third reason to care or worry about this is what has been called a kind of luxury fever and consumption cascades. You know, people, it's related somewhat to this notion of people don't save enough because they look at what's happening at the very top and they want to consume like that. So you have consumption cascades where you'll have very high-end consumption products leading to variations of that at lower income levels, leading to explosion of expenditures on private consumption. But the mirror image of that is an unwillingness of the population to invest in public goods and services. So you get underinvestment in public goods. Now, this is also partly because the higher up you are in the income distribution, the more you can buy out of the public good and privatize it. You know, provide your own educational outcome, provide your own healthcare outcome, provide your own gated community, your own security, your own everything. So the more that the top pulls away from the middle and the bottom, the less society sort of feels compelled to invest in the quality and quantity of the public goods that surround us all, the more likely it is that we see the privatization of things, which really all citizens deserve in a just and fairer society. And that brings me to the last reason to care, and that is politics. The concept of political power. In a recent lecture that I saw, a very compelling lecture, and I will advise you to go to his website, Larry Lessig of Stanford University lays out the role of money in what he calls the nomination process now in the United States. How does a candidate get through to run for office? More and more and more money, abetted by the Supreme Court decisions, which take off limits. But the more and more and more money, we need to note that most of that is spent by a very small fraction of Americans. He wrote this amazing piece a couple of weeks ago during the height of the Hong Kong protests, and he said Americans should be out in the street protesting because only 0.05% of Americans give the maximum contribution to their congressional candidates in the primary general election in 2000, the last one, and only 0.1% give $10,000 or more. His view is basically our nomination process at the level of Congress is pretty much dominated by pro-business, pro-wealthy elites who basically are making the campaign contributions. And then there's a study that he cites that has come out of Princeton University, basically showing how the economic elite and organized business interests are reflected in the candidates who are chosen, and the preferences of the average American simply don't show up in that process. He calls it the boss tweedism of the nomination process in the U.S., and likens it to the selection of candidates in Hong Kong by the Chinese, he would say, the pro-business Chinese elite. So whether you take that extreme a position, I think Piketty worries very much, Emmanuel worries very much, that the problem of income inequality translates dramatically into a problem of political inequality, even in a democracy which has a lot of institutional protections, and the U.S. does. And we can see that in the role of money in the nomination process in the United States. So those are reasons to worry about income inequality, starting with growth, going through educational opportunity, decline in social mobility, underinvestment in public goods, overinvestment in luxury consumption that people can't afford and they don't need, to the final point of control of the political process.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Laura. So part of my job as provocateur, I think, here is to keep the questions going, some of the parts that we're sure about and some of the parts that we're less sure about. The data, I think, are quite clear and compelling in terms of top 10%, top 1%. We can slice them slightly differently and define them slightly differently, but that's not really where the interesting part of the debate is. So one question for you, because I, as we think about what we should do about those data, right? I think one question is, that's part of what Laura offered us. One question is, do we understand the mechanism that's driving those data? And is it important to understand the mechanism before we start setting policy? Mm-hmm. So let me ask the first question to you, Emmanuel. Do we understand, how well do we understand the mechanism?
Yes, so yes, it is indeed very important to understand the mechanisms, and there are basically two views out there. So one is saying, look, technological progress, globalization has made, created opportunities for skilled people, to deploy their talents on a very broad scale, and that's partly, what is driving up this inequality. And so under that view, you don't necessarily want to curb that, because it reflects real, economic gain. So the problem with that view is that it cannot explain very well, the differences across countries. So I showed you the chart, the contrast between France and the US. So I know France is lagging a little bit behind the US, but after, 30, 40 years, you would think, that France would have, caught up with the new technology. I mean, France is subject as well, to globalization forces. So I don't think that story per se, explains everything. More compelling to me seems to be the story, that those changes are closely related to policy changes. And actually, you can see it very clearly in the data, that is the increase in income concentration really happens, in the US and in the UK when there are substantial policy changes, the Reagan-Thatcher revolutions, which is a broad number of policies. So for the top, a big decrease in income tax progressivity. The top tax rate in the US before Reagan was 70%. I mean, it's hard to believe today, that for many decades, actually, the US had an extremely progressive tax system. That came down as well the financial, regulations, and there is a very, very clear correlation between the size of finance in the economy and the level of the regulation. This finance was big up to the Great Depression when it wasn't very regulated. It was much smaller from 1933, from the New Deal up to the 70s, and it started growing again when it was deregulated. And so when you see it that way, it's not clear, that the surge in top incomes is a good thing. So the example of finance is perhaps the most stark one. That is, economists are hard-pressed to see, what has been the gain from having a much, much bigger financial sector, at least in the United States. Because very clearly, you can point to issues. It's clear that it's the financial sector, run amok, that is in large part responsible, for the initial shock, that created the Great Recession, the subprime explosion in lending. Mm-hmm. So if you see it that way, you think, that, the policies matter, and it's not clear, what that surge in top incomes has brought us in terms of.
Got it. And so it may be a combination of both of those two stories, right? I mean, we always try to sharpen our understanding of distinct stories. But and one fact that somebody pointed out to me not long ago is that, with the surge in incomes in China and India, that if instead of looking within country, within the U.S., if you look instead sort of across countries, take averages within country and look at the global cross-section, income inequality across countries has shrunk, has compressed, right? And part of that comes from the hundreds of millions of people. So that's consistent with sort of unskilled labor in the U.S. having to compete, and everywhere having to compete head-to-head with labor around the world, right?
So could I ask a question to follow up on that to you, Emmanuel? So when you look at the top 1%, you're saying the top 1%, the behavior in the U.S. is different from France, and I assume different from other European economies. But if you look below that, so suppose you look at the inequality of just labor income, not total income. you see that the U.S. has the greatest income inequality in labor income. We have this phenomenon of these, what your colleague called the super salary phenomena. You got people at the top 10% and the top 1% being paid labor income, which is way outsized relative to the middle and the bottom. But at the same point, I would say if you look below, say, if you look 90% and below, you do see evidence of the polarization effect, of the David Autor effect. Meaning there is a very good economist, also an MIT economist, who basically has looked at the effect of globalization and skill-biased technological change. And what he sees is across all of the developed countries, Europe, the US, Japan, you do see the same phenomena. You see the erosion of the middle in terms of number of jobs and income associated with those jobs. You see the takeoff of the top. The U.S. takes off much more. The skill bias is much stronger there, or the social norms are much weaker, or whatever, but the U.S. top takes off much more. But the middle erosion is common in that sense to the advanced industrial countries, and does, I think...
Consistent with the globalization.
That's consistent with, I would say, technology-enabled globalization, because I don't think we can tell the difference, frankly, between globalization and technology very well. I mean, the technology allows you to globalize and run supply chains and biases towards certain skills and away from other skills in certain geographies. And I think that actually is important below the top 1%. But I actually ask you what you think of that research.
No, I think this is, I agree with you, and I would emphasize, that in the long run, what makes, income grow are increases in skills, of people, and skills are provided, by education. And what is clear is that the US was at the vanguard in terms of education levels,
Yes.
in the post-World War II decades, and has fallen behind, that in the graduation rates have been flat pretty much in the US. Actually, they've been increasing sharply for women, but decreasing, for men. So overall, it's flat. And so the way the US, is going to compete with China, etc., is by always improving, its the skills, of its workforce. And here, that is a clear public policy problem, because the role of the government is overwhelming in terms of higher education, because it funds the vast majority of it. Historically, it's the GI Bills, things like that, that really increase education.
Yeah. And so I was getting the sense of an argument. I just want to make sure I'm clear on it, because the sort of classical economic view is if you want to tax incomes more, you are going to slow growth, right? And the classical question is, how much are you willing to slow growth to roll inequality back to where it was in 1970 on your graph, right? That's sort of a very natural neoclassical question. And I'm getting the sense that neither of you think of the question that way. So...
Yes. So my view on this is that inequality has become, so extreme in the United States that we are at a point where reducing it could actually improve economic growth. So a very good example was given by Laura in terms of education. That is, if you have talent but you don't have any resources in the current U.S. environment, it's hard to get a very good education. And so there you can see that if economic resources were more widely spread, you would favor, the breeding of talent, and make sure, that the talent can find, its way through the education system. And again, I would go back to the data, that is you really have two periods that are strikingly different. The post-World War II decades with a lot of taxation at the top and yet very strong economic growth, and the recent decades of lower growth, except at the top, and much less taxation. So while I agree with you that if you go to the very extreme, of a communist country, there you are going to hurt the economic system. There's no question about it. in terms of progressive taxation, it's hard to see evidence in the historical record, that I've talked about, that progressive taxation hurts economic growth.
And the sort of instability, you've looked a lot at the historical record. The idea in Piketty's book and in some of, this idea that we're not far from an inflection point in terms of instability, or perhaps we're not, right? And very hard to get a sense for this. But is there any way to calibrate whether we feel like we're,
Are you talking about political instability?
Well, but I think social, people in the streets, rallying cries, we've seen some in the last few years, but catalyzed by financial crisis in some ways, and less by the secular movement in some of these statistics.
Right.
But, if some of those trends continued another 10 years, what might we start seeing that would be disruptive?
I don't think economists, much less political scientists, would have an estimate of a tipping point. I honestly don't think that's right. I think my reading, and why I brought up Larry Lessig, is I think right now the way money is distorting the political process in the United States, it's not creating more populist upheaval. It's actually creating more control over those candidates that people can vote for. And that, to me, can last a good long time. I mean, we've also created, we've gerrymandered the systems. We've created systems where it's very hard for candidates who are not the candidates with money to break through. And we also saw, frankly, in the most recent little upsurge of populism, the bottom 99% had no political agenda at the end of the day. They didn't try to mobilize. They didn't try to nominate candidates. They didn't try to elect candidates. A lot of the people in the streets in that period of time are probably not going to vote this time. They're just not going to vote. So I don't think we can tell the tipping point, but I don't think right now I would say we're near the tipping point in the United States. I will leave it to Emmanuel to think about this in Europe.
It's hard to say. I mean, again, looking at the historical record, societies, that were democracies, like the United States, France, the United Kingdom, lived for a very long time, with very high levels of inequality, even though, they were really democracies. And it took really major shocks to the system. So in the US, think the Great Depression, a much more cataclysmic event, than the current Great Recession, or wars. Actually, you see progressive taxation being used heavily, really, at the moment when there are wars, with mass mobilization, which, changes the political context and makes it, perhaps easier to say that the rich also have to sacrifice because we are fighting a war. So I hope, we won't go through these shocks, but it just tells you that changing, policy drastically is difficult.
Thanks. Yeah. So one last quick question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. The trade-off in economics between equity and efficiency, right, is just so deeply ingrained in the way most of us think about things, right? That if you most equity attempts are just distortions to the price system, to the economic mechanism, and that they hurt us in terms of efficiency. So this question is really, most of us think about that in a fairly short horizon kind of a way, right? I mean, if you slap on taxes, people are going to respond to the taxes, and they're going to put in less effort and so forth. I'm just wondering if when we talk about growth versus taxes, right? We're in a longer horizon scenario, right? We're asking sort of over decades, how is this playing out, right? You're not looking at month to month or quarter to quarter or year to year here, right? This is long cycle stuff. So maybe that is it helpful to sort of think about that equity efficiency trade-off a little bit? I mean, I guess the different mechanisms that come into play over long horizons, right? Like education, right? If somebody said, I'm increasing taxes, nobody's going to say, there's a big education effect. Not if they're thinking in the short run, but with your data. So I'm trying to understand why there's so much more room to understand a violation of the equity efficiency trade-off in these longer horizon data.
I mean, I want to mention, again, the historical record. If you look at all advanced economies, they have very high levels of taxation. That is, societies, like in the United States, we share about a third of our income. That is, the government takes, 1/3 of our incomes to fund a number of programs, including, education, that for sure has a massive impact, on economic growth. And that's the way, advanced economies have proceeded. In Europe, in some countries like France or Scandinavia, it would be 50%. Of taxes they share, and I'm not aware, of any rich country except perhaps an oil country that has a high level of income that didn't go through, this big increase in size of government to fund things that we think are essential, for economic growth. That is the acquisition of skills and then social insurance instead of, having healthcare and making sure, you have resources for your retirement.
That's a very important point, because there are public assets that are part of that equation that don't enter most people's thinking in a
So I agree
horizon.
with you that at some point, it's true that if I told you, we are going to do 100% taxation, there would be a problem. but
We've established that.
Yes, but what is, you can go pretty far. I mean, countries go between 1/3 and 1/2, roughly speaking, of taxes. And in that range, it's hard to see a very big difference in growth rates. Sweden, Denmark, those are wealthy countries by any...
On a per capita growth rate basis, they do as well or better than the United States. Honestly, you cannot... And it's my understanding, Emmanuel, also, if people who've actually just looked at marginal income tax rates and sort of said, okay, well, here's the one where you make the big argument about how it affects labor effort or it affects savings, and you can't... The data doesn't show that. The data doesn't allow you to see in the range of changes that the U.S. has experienced coming down, that we've gotten more labor effort, we've gotten faster growth, we've gotten better investment, we've gotten more savings. The data doesn't show any of that. So I think that we're left with the notion that there's a very large range of changes in marginal tax rates which actually would have no effect on growth. And then I believe, Emmanuel, one of your arguments also is that when you cut the marginal tax rate very much, you actually encourage more income inequality because people go after bigger gains. The bigger gains are not being taxed at a very high rate, so why not go after them? If you're a CEO and you're being taxed at a 70% rate, it may not matter to you that much whether you're making 400 times the factory floor worker. But if you're only being taxed at a rate of 30%, hell, that really going after a bigger income gain to create a pool of wealth, to create an inheritance, to give a big endowment to a university, hey, that sounds pretty good.
I like the sound of that.
Sounds pretty good.
Let's open it up.
Can I say one other thing? Because I want to say that there are now a couple, I was just at the World Bank IMF meetings last week. There are a couple of important International Monetary Fund papers that have been done in the past year looking at cross countries, looking at redistribution policies, both tax and transfer policies. And honestly, they can find no negative effect of more redistribution on growth. Now again, as Emmanuel said, you could try so much redistribution that you would see an effect on growth, but within the range of things that we have observed around the world, the effect doesn't show up. And I think that's a very important point, because in the U.S., and this is really where I think it's important to end for U.S. discussion, we, at a pre-tax and transfer basis, before taxes and before transfer payments, the U.S. overall income inequality is measured by the Gini coefficient, so not the top 1%, but the overall Gini coefficient. We don't look more unequal than European economies. Actually, we look a little bit more equal on the pre-tax and transfer than some of them. But post-tax and transfer, the Europeans do much more to redistribute income. And the Scandinavian countries are among the ones that do the most, so they have a much more equal distribution of income, despite the fact that they use a lot of value-added tax and regressive taxes, but the net effect, because they have these very liberal progressive transfer payments, is to reduce inequality. It's to reduce inequality, and you do not see an effect on their per capita growth rates. You don't.
You do see some people leaving some of those countries
you know what?
for other places.
Yep. If you want to leave, that's a whole other issue.
Yep.
I'm saying for the country and the people who stay and the growth rate of the country,
fair enough.
That you don't see the effect.
Fair enough. Okay. Don Moore.
I'm Don Moore. I'm faculty here at the Haas School. And first, I want to say thank you so much for doing this here tonight. Building off the point of the mobility, the increased mobility of capital thanks to globalization, Thomas Piketty has suggested a global wealth tax as a solution to this problem. I wonder what your thoughts are about that as a solution and its political viability in the foreseeable future.
All right, Emmanuel.
Yeah, so I mean, it's good to know, what is the horizon that we should be aiming at. But obviously, a wealth tax globally is hard. Nevertheless, there are, more modest steps, that can help. And the first, there are two that are important. One is cracking down on tax havens, because the way individuals evade, taxes on capital income is by parking their money, in places like Hong Kong, Switzerland, etc. And that's something, that the wealthy countries, the big countries have an interest in fighting. The second one is about tax avoidance, this time from corporations that are very savvy about, banking, or putting their profits in low tax jurisdictions. And I think there are a number of things, that even a country like the United States could do on its own. So we hear, multinationals, they don't pay taxes. They don't pay the corporate tax till they repatriate their profits. And sometimes we have tax holidays, saying them, we are going to tax you low, if you repatriate. Why not have a wealth tax on profits, that are abroad and not repatriated? If you bring it back to the US, you avoid the wealth tax. So this is just an example to show you, that there are a number of corrective things, steps that the US could take.
And on the OECD countries have taken some real steps on some of the tax haven stuff. So if you basically in terms of information now you have to report much more information, or the financial institutions in which you're holding your accounts abroad have to report the information. So we've made tax haven effects on the personal level. I should say on the corporate level, I have a slightly different view. I think we should tax the owners of capital, not the organizational form. So I'm not really very interested in taxing the corporations. What we've done in the United States is we've made corporate forms highly unattractive. It's much better to be an S corp or a private, partnership or a hedge fund or whatever. Just don't be a corporation, because then you're subject to the corporate tax. So more and more income in business doesn't come through that form. That makes sense. You're going to do it. And that if you have to be in that form, by all means, keep your money outside. If you want to tax that money, you tax the dividends and you tax the capital gains of the company as they accrue, not as they are realized, but as they accrue to the holders of that capital. And the holders of that capital can be domestic citizens and they can be foreign citizens. And that's what I would do on corporate income. But.
So this would be equity price appreciation without a transaction is getting taxed, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, equity appreciation gets taxed in each year. Each year, as do dividends.
Please, Myron. If you could use.
I think I can work without the microphone unless you.
Okay, well that way we can record it for the video if that's okay. But I can repeat your question. Go for it.
Okay, so very quick statement. I've been a tax lawyer for the rich for 42 years, and I've never seen a tax increase de-incentivize any of my clients.
All right,
so that's the quick the question is this. If Milton Friedman were sitting there and was responding to this, and I'm sure I would disagree with him, but I want to know what he would say in response to your problems with income inequality.
Great. So let me repeat the question just real quickly. He mentioned that he's been a tax attorney for some 40 years, and he's never seen a tax increase de-incentivize his investors, his clients, their behavior. So a quite clear statement there. And then the second question was, If Milton Friedman were listening, hearing this, sort of, how would he respond? Hardcore sort of markets work perspective.
That's a very good question. He hasn't been around in a long time.
One view, I mean, I think it's important. One view, on Milton Friedman or Bob Lucas, would make is that, look, let's not worry about inequality, because 200 years from now we'll all be, much, much richer than we are.
Right.
But that is missing the point, is that really inequality matters not because we care, about an absolute, going above an absolute threshold. We care because we are in a society together and we evaluate how well we are doing really by comparing ourselves. So I think, inequality will be with us forever. So the modern version, because I debate sometimes, with people from the University of Chicago. So Kevin Murphy is a famous economist. So his view is that he's strongly in favor of education, and he blames the government for not providing, quality education. And he says, let's have vouchers, so that the market forces, are there to improve education. So I believe with him, that education is very important. I don't think vouchers are going to solve it. I mean, again, you look at the historical record, it's education, improves when the government makes, the investments.
In any event, you'd have to have a very progressive distribution of the vouchers, because if you go if you're going to accept a very large amount of income inequality, then educational opportunity is equally unequal, and therefore you've got to do something like a very progressive voucher system. Even if you believe the market is going to make the quality of the education higher, you've still got to worry about the distribution of the education across a highly unequal population income-wise.
Sounds like there's agreement on the importance of education in driving growth, and the importance of big gifts back to educational institutions. There's a question in back, please, ma'am.
So I come from a wonderful state of Tennessee, and one of the things our governor just did was he proposed a plan, and it passed our state legislature, to make community college free for all students in Tennessee, as well as making it easier to transfer from those community colleges to Tennessee state institutions like MTSU, University of Tennessee. What is the type of effect that you would expect that to see on a state like Tennessee, which is otherwise known for very regressive tax policies, not very known for its progressive policies on pretty much anything? And would you expect that sort of, if there is some success that you would expect from that, would you say it is possible for that to be replicated in other states that might have, take it even further with possibly free public education?
Thanks for that question. And I can see there are 5 people back there, so I want to make sure to get to all the questions. So we'll have to try and be quick. It's a very good question.
Yeah, I think having, quality and affordable education is fundamental. So those reforms look very good. Making it free is not enough. You also need the slots. Because the problem we've seen in California when they've cut down, on funding for community colleges, it wasn't that it was expensive, but they couldn't take in the students. And then the students had to go, to for-profit universities, who were really a terrible deal in terms of cost and education provided. So it's good to make it affordable, but let's make sure we have the bandwidth, to take in the students. And I think the experience of California has been fantastic, of those transfers. I see the students, coming from community colleges, often, from relatively low-income background, and they make their way to UC Berkeley. That's really a huge thing for upward mobility.
Thank you.
My only question would be, I'd like to know his 10-year plan, or her. I don't know if it's a female or a male governor, but I'd like to see the 10-year plan for paying for this. It's not free. Education is not free. Society, if you want society to pay for it, so you have equal opportunity and equal access for anyone at the same who can do it, What the slot issue is, how much resources are you willing to put into it? I have no idea what it means without knowing what is Tennessee going to cut or what taxes are going to raise to deliver on this promise.
Good point. Good point. Please, sir.
Yeah, hello. So, please correct me if I got your point wrong, but I understand that your main solution for this problem would be to increase taxes for the wealthiest, so that money can be invested in the bottom 90% or 99%. So my question is, isn't that assuming that first of all there's a lack of money invested in the bottom of the pyramid, so to say, and the second one is, I mean, wouldn't it be better to just have better quality money? Because I've seen a lot of cases that, money isn't actually the issue. It's just that it's not well invested in terms of providing quality services and stuff like that. And that way you will need to take, wealth away from the top. Thank you.
Yeah. So yes, I don't advocate, a direct cash redistribution. No. And that's not what countries do, actually. They don't do that much cash straight redistribution. But I think investing in public goods, that promote growth, education, quality investment in education is fundamental. And the taxes on the top are there, to prevent excess, in some sense at the top, not so much, as a money maker.
Can I also add one other thing? Because we talk a lot about education. Education is the easiest thing for economists to talk about. But I would say that, another thing that shows up here is high levels of, particularly in the U.S., high levels of poverty among children. We have a much higher rate of poverty among children than the other advanced industrial societies who have more tax and transfer solutions. So sometimes the transfer policy is basically support for parental leave. Support for parental leave. So I was at a conference today talking about investing in women. What we know around the world is that a large amount of now highly educated female talent is removed from the workforce in societies which do not invest in helping families with work-life balance issues. And the U.S. does nothing here at all. There are some state and local programs that occasionally do it, but certainly at the federal level, nothing. So I think we really need to say that there's a broad constellation of policies that can be used to support a thriving middle that go beyond education, and maybe start with, now a big thing we're all focused on is early childhood education. We're calling it education. It's largely to do with basically taking care of children and helping them foster their growth, and societies have programs that can help do that. And they are high-quality programs. I would disagree with the notion that a lot of these programs in Europe are low-quality. They're high-quality programs.
Thanks, Laura. Please.
So aside from voting for and fundraising for and raising money for candidates who support reducing income inequality in this country, what do you practically recommend that individuals like us, mostly MBAs in this room who are going to go in and immediately be part of the top 10%, okay, what actions do we take as individuals, whether it's through our companies or personally, to help reduce income inequality?
Good question.
That's nice.
So I'll start there because I think I've been very inspired lately by a couple of things. Number one is IKEA's decision to actually introduce a living wage calculated according to an MIT wage calculator. They're saying, no, we're not going to we can do better than the minimum wage. We can afford to do better than the minimum wage. The minimum wage in the United States has been stuck. It's declined by, I think, almost a quarter in real terms since 1968. It does not support a full-time worker on out of poverty. The evidence of economists throughout the United States are that increases in the minimum wage, again within ranges that we're talking about, could easily be absorbed with no decrease in employment. This is an issue of how you share the returns to productivity. This is about sharing returns. It's not about reducing returns. It's not about reducing growth. So an example of what a company can do is raise the wage they pay They are minimum wage workers. They don't have to be stuck with that wage. Another thing they could do is do some profit sharing. Do some profit sharing, because a lot of what's happened in the United States is that we've had a strong productivity growth that's fed itself into the top 1 or 10% of the labor income and into capital. You could redistribute some of that as a choice of human resources in your company to your workers. Why not?
And these are things you could do A/B tests on, right, to see what the impact is on people's
that's exactly right. Start with a small increase and then see what you can do over time.
Yeah.
And some great companies do this and they lead on this. And I would say if you're in the business community, you have to ask yourself what you can do. Another thing is training for workers. So there was just this HBS. They review all of their alumni who run companies or have high levels of executive authority in companies, and they said, what's the big problem? They said, education. What are you doing about it? Well, we're working with the public schools and we're working with community colleges. Oh, do you train on your own workforce? Well, no, actually, we would kind of prefer to outsource or to use a machine if we could. Well, come on, if you're going to try to educate, but you're actually not going to provide jobs for the people you're educating, it strikes me those are examples of things that could be done by companies.
Thanks for that, Laura. Next question, please. Thanks.
So, apologies, the question would be slightly provocative. So I think we're all here because we emotionally are in a way attached to an idea of income equality.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the data that you show demonstrates that income inequality has been there for like 70–80% of the time, and income equality has been for only a short fraction, and like naturally went back to income inequality. So is there a possibility that income inequality is like a natural result of a free economy? Is there any proof that income equality is not only the emotional thing that we share, but actually a sustainable state of economy that can be kind of lived through for many years to go?
Yeah, good question.
That's a great question. I mean, at least we have one historical experience where inequality was substantially lower. I hope it's not going to be an exceptional, time in human history. But in the end, it's those feelings precisely that are going to make things different. The fact that we all have, different extents, those feelings about the value of equality, translates into policies.
Important question. And also, at least for me, when I think about, again, that cross-country data, right, it may be that when a lot of the developing world, when the income per capita between India and China and the more industrialized countries starts to shrink, that will actually change some of these dynamics. So that's, it's already started to shrink, but even substantially more. So looking out 20 years from now, my own hunch is that that's going to take some of this inequality pressure off. But that's just because I view the sort of effect on wages from global competition as being an important piece of this puzzle.
Except, and I'm going to draw the except here and see what Emmanuel has to say. The other way of thinking about the technology is there is this great concern now about the technology basically displacing, even faster than globalization displaced, the middle skill level. So the machine gets smarter and smarter, faster and faster, and takes out more and more of what were middle skill jobs
across the world,
putting everybody into the bind of, how do you earn enough income? You have a job, but the job actually is not really, your skills are inferior to the skills of the machine that just displaced you. So what do you do? So this is a huge new discussion. Nobody knows the answer to this, but your optimism about globalization will become less powerful. Some people argue, no, but the machine erosion of the middle class is going to become more powerful. I don't know.
Yes, I don't have the answer, but I'm aware of the debate.
You're aware of the debate. We have to come back in a decade and see where we are in this.
So I think we have two more quick questions. If I could just add one point on somebody mentioned to me the other day, they were talking about Watson and a lot of, sort of where artificial intelligence, or what people are calling cognition services, is going, right? So if robots and machines replaced brawn in the economy over the last 100 years, will these newfangled methods start to replace low-level cognition services? Right. And this is a deeper displacement that people are concerned with. Please, question.
I'm wondering what your perspective is on a financial transactions tax, particularly as it relates to exotics and derivatives.
Thank you for that. And then we'll have one last question from the last person in the room. Please.
Great question.
I think, financial regulation has been a proven historical tool. Transaction tax has been tried, on small scale. The difficulty with it is that if it's not applied really globally, it's very easy to go around
evade it.
So it's a harder tool, I think, and yet unproven one, relative to more regulation.
Yeah, it is very difficult to implement. Very difficult. Please, last question.
My question may have been answered partially a couple questions ago, but because there are ballot measures in San Francisco and in Oakland at this time in terms of raising the minimum wage,
yes.
I'm wondering what you think the economic growth applications of that are in our economy, and then also in terms of the distribution of wealth or sharing.
Great. Last question. Thank you.
So I actually I was involved in doing some work with Mayor Lee's office in San Francisco about this, and I know the economists who did the background work on estimating the employment effects of the range of increase he's requesting. Some of those economists are here, like Michael Reich, who's basically done some of the very best work looking at the effects of minimum wage increases around the United States. I don't think that you can make the case that there's any significant employment effect, that this is an income-generating effect. What it does is it generates income for the bottom, and it's not just the minimum wage workers, but it tends to go up to about 30% of the workforce just because of the way it filters through. That adds to demand, and a lot of the same people, and this is the IKEA idea too, of the higher than minimum wage, that demand comes back in terms of buying goods and services that the same firms that have raised the minimum wage, they're going to get the demand for their products. So I think within the ranges that San Francisco and then Oakland is obviously, a lot of minimum wage jobs are local in nature. Right now, they're not being done by machines, although I must say today I was hearing at lunch about how they were going to have robots soon who could clean tables. So it was all a matter of time. But there are a lot of minimum wage jobs. Most minimum wage jobs are local in nature. They can't migrate very far. But of course, if you had a significant differential between a minimum wage in San Francisco and Oakland, you might see some migration. Actually, more to the point, the higher minimum wage in San Francisco, along with exploding housing prices, is leading workers to actually move to Oakland to live and keep their minimum wage job in San Francisco. But so these labor markets are tightly linked, and I think it makes sense. I would think it would make sense for us to have a regional increase in the minimum wage, which included San Jose, Oakland, and San Francisco. And I think that would be the ideal way to do this. So I applaud the measures in Oakland and San Francisco. And at least I did some of the work on San Francisco, and I'm convinced by the analysis that will not have a negative effect on employment. It will raise incomes. It will reduce poverty. So the estimates are 10% increase in the minimum wage reduces poverty by 2%. That's pretty good elasticity.
And some of this work has been done by David Card and some of our own economists.
David Card, Michael Wright.
Yeah.
A lot of it is done right here, and some of the best economists working on this are right here.
Thank you for that. So let me just very quickly sum up. Look, we saw the data. We saw the data within countries across time. We saw the U.S. versus France. We saw some cross-country data. When we think about the global data, right, if you think about China and India versus the U.S., it does not look like it's separating but compressing, but still the data are clear in terms of the acute inequality within countries and showing no sign of relenting. We talk a bit about the mechanisms. Emmanuel helped us think a little bit about policy changes, fundamental policy changes that are creating a dynamic over these longer horizons as one school of thought, and then there's a globalization/technology school of thought on what's driving this. Understanding the mechanism for most people is important for thinking about which of our various policy levers might be the best ones to address. And then the so what ideas that Laura presented were really, I think, important for us to chew on, right? These macroeconomic issues of stunted consumption demand, which are such an important part of the macroeconomic picture, the educational opportunities channel, this public versus private goods channel, which is really an important one, given how important public goods like education are to growth capacity in an economy. And then the question of politics and sort of, I heard her comment or answer to my question to suggest that maybe things aren't getting less stable. There's sort of an investment in stability in the status quo of where things are right now. So that another dynamic to watch. These are big. They're societal. The whole world is watching these sorts of phenomena, and we have two of the best thinkers anywhere up on the dais. I want to thank both of you for being here. Thank you very much. And my thanks to all of you for being at this Dean Speaker Series. Hey, just one thing, if I may flag it. It's a student conference, The Challenge of Inclusive Development, a conference that's going on here on the campus, Berkeley campus, October 31 and November 1. The Challenge of Inclusive Development. Have a safe night, all of you. Thank you.